Just want to welcome everyone. My name is Anne Conway. I'm the director of the Museum of Work and Culture. Certainly want to thank Ken and Jim for your work and your participation in this program. We are certainly very excited to present this program today as such a wonderful complement to the exhibit that we have right now, the Smithsonian poster exhibit that we have at the Museum of Work and Culture. And for those of you, maybe some of you are not familiar with the Museum of Work and Culture, because I know you're a little bit from all over the place. But we are located in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. We tell the story of immigration and work. We tell the story, primarily the story of the French Canadians who immigrated to the city of Woonsocket because they were the largest group to immigrate to Woonsocket. But through our gallery program, it is such a, we have such wonderful opportunities to expand our theme and to tell important stories and certainly important historical happenings like what we are going to be talking about today. So I want to thank Deborah for her hard work and have to have been in contact with all of you today. And again, thank you so much for attending. And if you want to know more about the Museum of Work and Culture, please visit the Rhode Island Historical Society's website. We are at www.rihs.org. And if you look on the Museum of Work and Culture, we have a lot of very interesting events coming up in the month of March, and actually another lecture tomorrow as well that on Zoom at 1 p.m. The Rhode Island Historical Society is also celebrating, I didn't say that the Museum of Work and Culture is celebrating 25 years this year. So we have so many interesting programs, but the Rhode Island Historical Society is celebrating a bigger milestone, 200 years of history. So again, so many amazing programs going on all year round. So please visit our website and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. We're always there to answer your questions and to welcome your suggestions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. So today we're here for a talk about Day of Remembrance. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized removal of people of Japanese ancestry from the west coast of the United States. Over 110,000 Japanese, 2/3 American citizens, were forced from their schools, businesses, and homes, and were incarcerated behind barbed wire fences and guarded by armed US soldiers in 10 camps located in desolate parts of the country, all in the name of, quote, military necessity. February 19 is recognized every year by the Japanese community throughout the US as the Day of Remembrance. And on this, its 80th anniversary, Ken Nomiyama and Jim McIlwain will speak about Executive Order 9066 and its consequences during World War II and today. This program is part of Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans and World War II, a Smithsonian poster exhibition on display through March 31st. Programs for Righting a Wrong are sponsored by the New England Japanese American Citizens League. So let's introduce our speakers. Ken Nomiyama is Japanese American, born during World War II at Tule Lake, the incarceration camp located in Northern California. He's a retired businessman living in Newport, Rhode Island, with a strong interest in the history and the plight of the Japanese American. He is on the board of the Tule Lake Committee. Sorry. Jim McIlwain, Professor Emeritus of Neuroscience, Brown University, is a student of Japanese American history with a special interest in the service of Japanese Americans in the U.S. Army during World War II. He is a life member of the Japanese American Veterans Association and an honorary member of Fox Company chapter of the 42nd Veterans Club of Honolulu. Ken and Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Ken's picture is not up on my screen, so I don't know what happened to him. But I shall proceed.
He'll be on the video.
Okay. Ken and I, in discussing the organization of this presentation, decided we would give a sort of an introductory part at the beginning And I will take care of that. And then Ken will come in and talk about some of the specific legacies of Executive Order 9066. Anyone who has not studied Japanese American history will wonder what in the world was Executive Order 9066 about, what did it say exactly, and why is there a day of remembrance dedicated to it each year, this being the 80th anniversary of the signing of this order. So let's go to the next slide. And this is what was just summarized by Deborah. Executive Order 9066 initiated the evacuation of over 120,000 Japanese American people from the West Coast of the United States. They were forced from their homes and confined in 10 relocation centers operated by the government. And 2/3 of these people were American citizens. There were no, these people were not protected by the usual constitutional barriers against arbitrary confinement. There were no hearings. There were no charges brought against them. So this is a very sort of unusual sort of phenomenon. You were picked up and moved off of the West Coast of the United States, depending on where you lived and who you were. Those were the main reasons. So one of the next slide, please. You are very tempted to ask, given this, how could this happen? Well, this is a poster from the exhibit that's ongoing now at the Museum of Work and Culture that asks that question. And I would encourage everybody that can to go and see this exhibit. It's very instructive. You will see in the lower left-hand corner of this image, sort of iconic picture of Pearl Harbor. And of course, Pearl Harbor had a lot to do with what happened and with Executive Order 9066. So let's go to the next slide. December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor, destroying a large part of our Pacific fleet, killed a number of people, wounded a number of others. And this had a huge effect both on the American psyche, and Japan became a defined enemy in World War. This was our introduction to World War II, actually. And Japan became one of the enemy countries that we were at war with. So the suspicion and anger that emerged from all of this sort of spread toward people of Japanese ancestry wherever they lived, particularly in Hawaii and on the mainland in the United States. So let's go to the next slide and we'll hear one of these people talking.
My dad was listening to the radio, then they found out that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We knew something bad was going to happen.
Suddenly, to be Japanese was then to be identified with the enemy.
When I came home from school, Mom was crying and she said, they took Papa away, FBI took him away.
First thing they said after the train started moving was pull the shades down. We were prisoners.
Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II.
Next slide. The anti-Asian, anti-Japanese sentiment was not new in the United States at the beginning of World War II. It had been going on for quite some time. It actually began with the Chinese, who were the first major Asian immigration group. They came to America to help in the mines, to help build the railroads, and a number of other jobs that needed labor and cheap labor. This caused a lot of trouble because of competition with other labor groups, and with the fact that the Chinese tended to stay together, and they became a very suspected or suspicious organization. The sentiment built up over the years until in 1882, the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's cutting off all immigration from China. From then forward until later on in the history of the country, that was all changed. The Japanese had begun to come over in the middle of the 20th century, 19th century, with the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which made it very difficult for young farmers, for instance, in Japan. They were looking for places to go, and there was a great need for them for instance, in Hawaii, for working in the cane fields and also on the mainland. So there was a large Japanese immigration to this country beginning in about 1860 or something like that. This too ran into the business of the sort of racially tinged antagonism to large identifiable immigrant groups. And you'll see here the trouble came with whether they should be able to go to school with the white children. There were big problems associated with that, led to some very interesting interactions with the Japanese government. And then there's the politicians got on their benches and cried about keeping California white and so forth. There was a United States Senator, James Phelan, saying that. Of course, there was a lot of sentiment now to slow down this increasing population of Japanese. And of course, if you wanted to move them out of California and Oregon and Washington, the Pearl Harbor attack was a great excuse to get on the soapboxes and argue for this. So can we have the next slide, which shows a couple of newspaper accounts of reactions to the Pearl Harbor attack. And these two argued that there should be something done to get the Japanese off the West Coast, out of the military significant areas. Where were they exactly? The next slide shows the population of people of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii, California, Washington, Oregon, and Arizona. So very heavily populated in Hawaii, where 40% of the population in 1940 was of Japanese ancestry. California, Washington, Oregon, and Arizona were places where there were large populations, relatively large populations, with California and Washington leading the pack. Hawaii was immediately placed under martial law after Pearl Harbor. So Executive Order 9066 did not have the same effects there that it had on the West Coast of the United States. So the pressures built on the Roosevelt administration, and of course the story ends and begins with his signing Executive Order 9066. That's on the next slide, please. So what exactly did this executive order do? Well, it authorizes the Secretary of War and military commanders to prescribe military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Note, it doesn't mention that these were Japanese people or German people or Italian people. And we were at war with all those governments by this time. So the military exclusion zone was established, as you might expect, where there were Japanese people living, people of Japanese ancestry living. It was half of Washington, western half of Washington and Oregon, all of California eventually, and parts of Arizona close to the Mexican border. The job of enforcing this was turned over to military commanders, and the military commander in this case was the leader of the Western Defense Command, General DeWitt. The next slide shows the army, which was taking charge of this whole evacuation process.
I got it. Thank you. I'll talk to you.
Okay, Paul.
Sorry.
The evacuation was run by the army, and in areas where there were large concentrations of Japanese people of Japanese ancestry, signs went up on all the local telephone poles and so forth, announcing that all persons of Japanese ancestry in this vicinity, both alien and non-alien being the term used for citizen, both alien and citizen will be evacuated from the above area by 12 o'clock, May the 30th, 1942. The other component of this action by the Western Defense Command was simply to limit the movement of people. There was a curfew. No Japanese person will be permitted to move into or out of the above area after 12 o'clock noon, May the 23rd, and also a separate Western Defense Command dictate said that they must remain at home between 8 p.m. and 9 a.m. It's important to keep in mind that there are these two dimensions of this process, the evacuation and the curfew aspect, because that comes up later in very significant ways. Okay, so we have the next slide, please. So everyone had to get out of their homes and get out of their farms and close their businesses and get rid of their stock, et cetera, et cetera. This caused a huge economic loss to the people who were affected by this. And some of this was made up later on, but not completely. Next slide shows the beginning of the evacuation, where the people were ordered to appear at a certain location where there would be buses or trains or other transportation to take them to their first destination. They were told to bring only what they could carry. So all of their family possessions, as furniture, et cetera, had to be disposed of, stored, or gotten rid of in some way. Everyone was given a family number or a number, and the whole family would get the same number, and each one would get a tag. And you could see this family here, the Mochida family is all tagged, and including their baggage that they were taking with them to their first stop. The first stop, the next slide shows the first stop were so-called assembly centers. These were usually hastily constructed hastily constructed places where the people could live. Some of them had been army camps previously. They already had secure fences and guard towers. And you can see here, this guard tower, the machine gun is pointed in toward the barracks, not out toward the supposedly threatening population, surrounding population. There the guards are with their bayonets fixed on their guns. So this is one at the Santa Anita racetrack. The next slide shows that Tanforan, some of the people had to stay, to start with at least, in the horse stalls at these old racetracks. This is the Tanforan Assembly Center at San Bruno racetrack. These were only recently mucked out. I think that's the technical term for clearing out all of the things that the horses had left. They had been whitewashed on the inside, but they smelled, and people complained about how the unhealthy atmosphere in them. Some people noticed that there would be a plaque on the outside of their horse stall with the label that said Seabiscuit stayed here originally, and they had bragging rights about having spent time in the same horse stall as the famous horse Seabiscuit. This is a Dorothea Lange photograph, one of the famous collection that she put together. The next slide are images done by Mine Okubo of some of the things that people faced as they went to these hastily constructed barracks in the assembly centers. They were very ill furnished, usually an iron cot of some kind, but the people had to fill bags with straw or hay to serve as mattresses. And so Mine Okubo shows that in the left-hand picture here. One of the other problems was that there was the toilets were community organizations. There were initially no barriers between adjacent toilets, no privacy. As time went by, this was fixed as the men in the camp began to build a barrier or separate panels between the toilets. One very interesting interview on the Dinsho collection shows a woman saying that using these things was very stressful. You were so close together, you could even hold hands with the person next to you if you were so inclined. So that's Mine Okubo. She pictures herself in both of those pictures. The next slide shows that the next step in this migration from the very small temporary assembly centers, which are in this slide, you can see a little black dots on the map of the military exclusion zone. The people moved from these assembly centers to the main camps, the so-called incarceration centers that were not run by the Army, but by the War Relocation Authority. So a very neutral term to apply to these is WRA camps. There were 10 of these, 2 in California, one at Tule Lake, the other at Manzanar. Manzanar had actually served as a relocation, as a assembly center at first too. So some people went there and stayed there. There were 2 in Arizona, Poston and Gila River. One in Minidoka in Idaho, at Topaz in Utah, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Amachi in Colorado, and 2 in Arkansas, Rower and Jerome in the Mississippi River Delta. These were the sort of the so-called permanent camps, and this is where people stayed, many until the very end of the war. Can we have the next slide, please? Just as some shots of what they looked like. Manzanar on the left, that's in California. Rower, Arkansas, in the swamps adjacent to the Mississippi River. Heart Mountain, Wyoming. There's Heart Mountain in the background of that image, where the place gets it, for which it gets its name. And then Tule Lake, which we'll hear more about later, which was a prehistoric lake bed. These are still very desolate places. I've been to all of them, and they're all worth a visit, but you can imagine having to live in a place like this for 4 years or so. Next slide, please. Once again, the people faced the same guard towers and barbed wire fences and armed guards that they had in there. The assembly centers, Manzanar on the left, you can always recognize Manzanar because the mountains in the background, they seem to attract the attention of the photographers. Next slide, please. This gives you an idea of what it was like living in one of these camps. Typically, the people stayed in barracks. These barracks were specially constructed for the camps. There were usually 5 long barracks, 100 feet by 20 feet wide, surrounding a central area where the men's and women's latrines were located, a laundry, and a mess hall. This would be a so-called block, which was the organizational basis for the camp administration. A typical unit on the right was a 20 by 25 foot apartment. They were called apartments for a family. A large family may get 2 of these adjacent to one another. They were not very fully furnished. There was 1 light bulb, a coal burning heater, no running water, no toilets, no kitchen, and no privacy. The barriers between the adjacent apartments did not go all the way to the ceiling. So from one end to the other, you could hear everything that was going on in your barracks if it was loud enough. The next slide Shows one of the things that people complained about, of course, they had to stand in lines to go to the mess hall or to the showers or to the toilets or to do any kind of business with the camp administration. So this is the long line waiting for the mess hall at Manzanar. This also, this mess hall arrangement had a very large effect on the traditional Japanese way of having the family together at a meal with the father at the table. The next slide shows that this was broken up because of this communal mess hall facility where everybody sort of ate together. There was a competition between the various mess halls as to who could get the best Japanese cooks to prepare the meals that people really wanted and expected. The young children realized early on that they could run from one mess hall to the other and find the best one and see where and visit with all of their friends. Once again, this sort of destroyed this traditional Japanese way of having the family together at a meal. So a structural change had occurred as a result of this family meal disruption. The next slide shows that there were schools in the WRA administration set up schools at various levels through high school. There were no college level classes given. These were often taught by Caucasian teachers hired from the outside. There were efforts to get students who were of college age out of camp and into colleges around the country that would accept them. And this resulted in about 5,000 young students being able to leave camp and going to colleges elsewhere in the United States. The people in the camps tried to bring as much of life back to normal as they could. There were sporting events, there were balls and beauty contests and things like that, which of course never made it exactly normal, but was an effort to do that. The next slide, which is shows that life went on at the camps. There were weddings at Tule Lake. There's a new baby born at Tule Lake. It's not Ken over there in that picture. And funeral at Tule Lake. The interesting statistic here is that while the camps were in operation, more people actually, fewer people left the camps than were born there. So there were, the birth rate exceeded the death rates in the camps. All of this is just by way of sort of giving you a flavor of what it must have been like to be in one of these camps. It went smoothly to some extent, but there was always some pressure and there were always some problems, which we're going to discuss now. The next slide just introduces the next part of this presentation. Resistance began very soon, and it took a number of forms. And each one of these forms of resistance is as much a legacy of Executive Order 9066 as anything else is. So I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Ken Nomiyama, who will take us through the rest of the presentation. Ken, over to you.
Thank you. From the photographs that Jim showed, the slides, it seemed to be pretty serene, quiet, peaceful. Things were well. However, the fact is that those Japanese who were in these camps were not there by choice. They were forced into these camps. They were evacuated. They were put into these camps because the government dictated this. 120,000, 2/3 who were American citizens. My parents were American citizens. They were second generation Japanese Americans. they were taken out of their homes and put into these camps. And from the very beginning, even though Jim hadn't talked about it, there was some resistance. There was some questioning of what the government was doing. Why was there an executive order 9066? Why are we being pinpointed for this evacuation and mass incarceration? And so some of the things that we'll talk about now are some court cases challenging this executive order. We'll look at the question of loyalty that was imposed on the Japanese. One of the main reasons that the Japanese were put into the camps was there was a question of their loyalty. There was a large distrust among the population in the government of the Japanese, and the threat that they posed to helping the Empire of Japan on the west coast of Japan, on the west coast of America, aiding them to attack America. And so that's the reason this exclusion zone was set up. We're going to look at some of the resistance in the military, in the U.S. military that was created, and some signs of so much discontent that Americans were willing to give up their citizenship, American citizenship. And we'll look at this, and we'll call this the Renunciation program. Next slide, please. So early on in 1942, one thing that happened was that some test cases were brought forward. 3 young men, and if you could look at the photographs, Fred Korematsu in the San Francisco Bay Area, Gordon Hirabayashi in the Seattle area, and Min Yasui in Portland. They were questioning the legality, the constitutionality of this executive order, and therefore they wanted to create a test case, and so each one of them did things that were against the executive order and the evacuation orders. Korematsu refused to evacuate. Hirabayashi not only refused to leave the area, but also he violated the curfew law, as did Yasui. If you remember, one of the earlier slides that Jim showed that the Japanese who were in these exclusion zones were required before the evacuation to be in their homes from 8 o'clock at night until 6 the next morning. These young men flaunted that rule to be arrested to test the law. They were, in all 3 cases in the early 1940s, found guilty. The cases were appealed. They were taken to the Supreme Court, and again, quickly they were tried in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the convictions and guilty verdicts for these 3 young men. And the whole premise was that there was a military necessity to imprison, and incarcerate the Japanese. We'll come back to this a little bit later. Next slide. At the same time, even though the question of the Japanese population loyalty was a major concern, the government wanted, because of some reasons, to test the loyalty of that mass of people of Japanese ancestry who were being incarcerated. They came up with a questionnaire, and the reasons for the questionnaire were, number one, the primary reason was to test and question the loyalty of the Japanese, but it was for the reasons of there were some young people who were incarcerated, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, who had their college education curtailed because they were taken away from their homes in Berkeley or San Francisco or Seattle, and they were going to school at University of California or University of Washington. They had to leave because of this evacuation order, and the government was trying to see if some of them could resume their college careers in places other than the West Coast and areas that might welcome them on the East Coast or Midwest. The second reason was that there was a shortage of manpower during the war, and they needed people to work the farms, to raise the crops, to feed the population, and also to feed the mass of people who were incarcerated. And so they wanted to see if there were some among them who were loyal to serve in this agricultural pursuit. Thirdly, the war was going on. There was a shortage of troops. And so they wanted to see if there was enough loyalty among some of these young Japanese men to become members of the US military. And therefore, this loyalty questionnaire was imposed on all those incarcerated over the age of 17. So that's men, women, anybody over the age of 17. There were two questions that were very contentious. Question number 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Now, this was a very confusing question to many because they were wondering if you answer yes, and it was a matter of either a yes answer or a no answer. If you answered yes, does that mean you're automatically being drafted into the military? And also, if you're a 70-year-old woman, a grandmother, does that mean that you have to serve? Question number 28 was also very troublesome. It was badly worded. It was ill-conceived. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America? And further down, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government. Now, the people who were incarcerated, among the 127,000 were first generation Japanese Americans, second generation Japanese Americans. The first generation Japanese Americans were like my grandmother and grandfather who came from Japan, first generation. They came to America. They were not allowed to get American citizenship. They were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to get American citizenship. Therefore, the question being asked was to them, do you forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor? If they said, yes, I forswear my allegiance, that means that they're cutting off their ties to Japan. They're becoming people of no country. Now, my father, he's being asked, will he forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor? And so were other young men and women and who were second generation or American citizens. None of them had allegiance to the Japanese emperor. So they thought this was a trick question to them. Many of them did not speak Japanese. They had not visited Japan. They had not been to Japan. They're being asked to forswear allegiance to an emperor that they have no allegiance to anyway. And so many of those 80,000 of the Japanese population in the incarceration camp answered no to questions either 27 or 28 or both. They were no answers, or they qualified their answers by saying, if you return my rights, my constitutional rights, and take my parents out of the camp and put us back, let us go back and live freely where we were, then I'm willing to serve in the armed forces. However, over 5,000 of those who took the questionnaire answered no in one form or another, and some with a conditional answer. They were considered to be no. They were considered to be unloyal to disloyal to America, and to be questioned. And eventually what happened was Tule Lake, one of the 10 camps that Jim mentioned earlier, was a camp located in Northern California. This is where I was born, and my parents were. This camp had the largest number of no responses, and therefore that camp, from the other 9 camps, they sent not all but most of those who answered no to Tule Lake. It became a segregation center, a high-risk, high-security segregation center where the so-called troublemakers were sent. Therefore, those who answered yes from Tule Lake were sent to the other camps. The other camps, the other 9 camps, became a little less troublesome. Tule Lake became a hotbed of turmoil and confrontation. Next slide, please. As a result of many things that were going on, number one, the incarceration to begin with, the loyalty questionnaire, and the general mistreatment of the Japanese in these camps. Ironically, at this time, the government, the U.S. government, was trying to recruit some members of the Japanese population to serve in the U.S. military, and among them, partly because of the loyalty questionnaire, there were many young men who said, "I will not be willing to be drafted." And so if you look at the statistics on the left, you could see each of the camps, and eventually 315 of the young men resisted the draft. They said that they will not be drafted. They were taken to court. In most cases, in the state courts, in the jurisdictions of the state courts, they were found guilty. Their prison sentences were anywhere from 3 years. And in one case, for those who were found guilty in Arizona, that judge was a little bit more lenient. He fined each one of those in the Arizona camps who resisted a 1 penny fine. Tule Lake was the only camp with this 26 draft resistors who were found innocent. However, the irony of that is they were found innocent. They weren't put in prison, but they had to go back to Tule Lake, where there was a barbed wire fence enclosing the grounds with armed guards and security towers and tanks, armed tanks over guarding the property. In addition to draft resistance, there were those who were already in the military, Japanese, who said that they would not fight for America. What happened was that soon after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese who were in the military, my uncle being one, and I'll talk about him a little bit later, were reclassified from 1A to 4C. The 4C designation, social service designation, meant that they were unfit for military duty because they were aliens. They were reclassified as aliens. They were in the military. Their guns were taken away. They still had to march in formation, but they were given sticks, and they carried the sticks to simulate guns. Wherever they went, they were not allowed to go freely. They were guarded by other U.S. military, the white U.S. military. And there were other cases where they were just not treated equally to the other white army. My uncle refused to continue his basic training. His complaint was that his constitutional rights were taken away. His family, which was my father and my mother, were in a camp. He was wondering why this had happened to his brother. He wanted to speak to his military commander. That was refused. He refused to continue his basic training. He was taken to court, a military court. He was found guilty. He was court-martialed, given a dishonorable discharge, sent to Leavenworth State Penitentiary for imprisonment of 6 years or so. There were 21 other members of his group who did the same thing. They were called the DB boys, the disciplinary barrack boys, and they got prison sentences anywhere from, in my uncle's case, 6 years up to 20 years in prison at Fort Leavenworth. Eventually, in my uncle's case and in the case of some of those in his DB boy unit, they brought it back to court. This happened 30 years later. They presented their case and they were given their dishonorable discharge overturned. However, the court martial remained. However, my uncle felt that the government was able to acknowledge the fact that they were wrong in the court martial. Next slide, please. So there were those who resisted the military and those who resisted the draft. However, there were those who wanted to prove their loyalty, or for other reasons, they were willing to fight for the U.S. military, in the U.S. military. And you could see the numbers at the top of the screen. Eventually, there were 31,000 Japanese Americans who served in uniform, and 9,000 of those were young men and women who were in these camps, but who were willing to leave the camps, leave their parents behind in a lot of cases, and fight in either the Pacific Theater, where there was a military intelligence unit in the Pacific, or in the European theater, where the famous 100 Infantry 442nd Regimental Combat Team fought. And you could see here in that right-hand picture, the Japanese unit with some German prisoners. Next slide, please. Now, while this was going on, there was a lot of trouble at Tule Lake. Tule Lake, as I mentioned, was reclassified as a segregation center. It was a high security area where there was a lot of clamor. This is where the no-nos were sent. And because of discontent at Tule Lake, what was happening was that there was a shortage of food. The Japanese who were incarcerated there saw that a lot of the food was being stolen by the white administration and taken out and sold on the black market. The medical facilities were bad. And there was no constitutional rights that they were being given. The due process had been taken away. They were not able to present their claims or protest to the administration. It led to martial law being instituted for several months at Tule Lake. This led to searches in the barracks. And if you could see the next slide, a stockade was set up where the troublemakers, so-called troublemakers, were sent. The stockade was an illegal act of being set up. It was not allowed by U.S. law, but the authorities at the Tule Lake camp set up a stockade. It was set up to house 100 people. They crammed 200 men into this facility. They were treated brutally. There was a huge food shortage. They were told to stand outside in the bitter cold of winter for 2 or 3 hours, standing up for roll call. They were forced to live in tents with no cover on the floor with the snow falling. Eventually, in addition to the stockade, a jail was constructed in 1944, and this was to house other who the government considered to be a danger to the camp and to the US. Next slide, please. You could see that within Tule Lake, there was a bit of a revolution. There were those who were very discontent. They set up at this point early on, the administrators of the camp allowed for these units to be formed. These were young men who were practicing their military skills. They woke up early in the morning, got in formation, and you could see the bands that they're wearing, which to show some sort of tie to Japan. This group, one name of that was used is the Hoshidan. And so could I have the next slide, please? Because of this kind of movement, this kind of attitude, the people were embittered by the treatment that they were receiving, particularly at Tule Lake Camp. It got to the point where several thousand were willing to give up their American citizenship. So these were the second generation Japanese Americans who were in the camps. They were so embittered by the treatment they were receiving by the US government because their constitutional rights were being taken away. They decided at that moment to give up their citizenship. As it ended up, there were over 5,500 or so whose applications were accepted by the US government to have their citizenship taken away. The government was willing and encouraged this sort of action, trying to get rid of these Japanese Americans who they considered to be troublemakers out of the country. A part of this renunciation also included to be taken out of the US and shipped to Japan. Next slide, please. However, soon after this happened, the Japanese who had filed and gotten acceptance of their renunciation applications felt and realized that they had made a very large mistake. They reacted to a lot of pressures that were being put on them to renounce those. There were several reasons for this Renunciation Act. One was that those who were militaristic, and you saw that one slide earlier of those men who were in formation, they put pressure on others to renounce, and so there was not only psychological pressure, but in some cases physical intimidation for these people to renounce. In some cases, these people just felt that the US government was no longer their protector, and therefore they didn't want to stay in this country. However, after seeing what they had done hastily, they decided that it was not a wise move. An American lawyer who was associated with the Northern California ACLU by the name of Wayne Collins, stepped in and tried to restore the citizenship of those who had renounced. The government resisted his efforts and made it very difficult for him to take his case to court. He had to file each application individually, and over time it took him 23 years, but he got about 5,000 of the 5,500 of the renunciation applications overturned, and the citizenship of these Japanese Americans restored. To this day, the Japanese American community is very, very appreciative of the work that he has done, and he's considered to be a hero among many of the Japanese, especially among those whose families were positively affected by his actions. Next slide, please. So this is a letter that he wrote to one individual, and if I could just read the end part of it. The judgment cancels your renunciation, that is to say, from the beginning. This means your renunciation was void from the time it was made, and in consequence, you always have been and still are a US citizen. Go to the next slide, please. So the war ends in 1945. Germany surrenders in May. Japan surrenders in August 1945. In 1940, at the end of 1945, most of the camps close. Tule Lake stays open until mid-1946 because of those who had renounced, the camp stayed open to keep them imprisoned until they were shipped off to a Department of Justice camp elsewhere. Next slide. The consequence of those who fought on the side of the Americans in the US military in World War II was very astounding. If you look at that picture on the right, you could see on the right-hand side of that thing on the wall, there were photos of 21 Japanese Americans who won medals of honor. And this is at Camp Shelby where these men trained. And in total, there were over 9,000 Purple Hearts that were awarded to the Japanese who fought during World War II. And again, this was in a segregated Japanese unit. The Japanese were not trusted enough to be commingled with other of the military. They were kept into their own segregated unit and commanded by white officers. On the right hand of this slide, you could see that President Truman awarding the 442nd a presidential unit citation. Next slide, please. Now, moving forward, in the mid-1970s, the atmosphere in the country had changed. The war had ended 30 years earlier. There were civil rights movements going on. There was marches in the South. The university campuses were very active. There were free speech movements. The people who had been incarcerated in these camps were getting older. And their children, those who were now 25 or 30 years old, were beginning to question what had happened. The Japanese community were very quiet about this for the most part. My parents, for example, never spoke about the experience of camp, and it was not something that we talked about. I was born at Tule Lake in 1942. My parents were incarcerated there, as well as at Minidoka. We never talked about it. However, in the 1970s, questions were being raised. Pilgrimages were taking place at some of the camps by the younger generation, and enough pressure was put on the U.S. government where a commission was set up. It was called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, very long-winded term, to study the constitutionality of what had happened during World War II. Why had Executive Order 9066 been signed off in the first place? Was there a military necessity to incarcerate 120,000 Japanese? Therefore, this commission's was set up to investigate this, and over the course of several years, the commission, made up of 9 members of the U.S. government and very high-level members of the U.S. society, held meetings in some of the major cities in the country where there was a large population of Japanese. They went through testimony with 750 people and thousands of other written testimonies on what had happened during World II to get a perspective on the suffering and the thinking that went on during this period. It took years of investigation and testimony and thinking and lobbying for this to reach its conclusion. Next slide. As part of this investigation, there were a few people who were doing some research on behalf of the commission, but also independently for some academic work. And so 2 people who were very instrumental in digging through the information were Peter Irons, who was an academic at the time, and Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, who was working for the commission as a researcher. What they came up with was digging through the files, and the Information Freedom Act had allowed more information to be available. And what they were looking at was anything related to the action of Executive Order 9066 and the Supreme Court decisions at that time to see what evidence there was to support the claims that the government and the Army was using, that there was a question of loyalty among the Japanese in America. And so they were looking to see if there was any evidence to support that there was sabotage that was a possibility or that had taken place by the Japanese. For example, shining lights or radio signals to a Japanese submarine fleet off the West Coast for their attack. And this is the kind of information that was used by the government, the Department of Justice, and the military to support their case in the Supreme Court during the cases of Korematsu, Hirobayashi, and Yasue. Next slide, please. What they discovered was that they found some information that the government thought that they had destroyed, but they found a copy of the report that had long been missing. And here's some examples of some of the information that was dug out. The first thing, and I'll read to you, the Ringel report, which was in 1941, December 20th, which was right after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese problem has been magnified out of its true proportion. The Japanese problem being the Japanese-American problem on the west coast of the US. The next report, J. Edgar Hoover to Attorney General, February 3rd, 1942, again after Pearl Harbor. The necessity for mass evacuation is based primarily upon public and political pressure rather than on factual data. The third is a memo to the Assistant Attorney General. And this refers to General DeWitt, who is in charge of designing the program for evacuation on the West Coast, setting up the military exclusion zone, and carrying out the initial part of the evacuation. He says in this report, you will recall that General DeWitt's report makes flat statements concerning radio transmitters and ship-to-shore signaling. Further down, there is no doubt that these statements were intentional falsehoods. In other words, what was uncovered were lies made by the military, the Department of Justice, to the Supreme Court to support their cases in these three cases that I was talking about, to support their cases to justify the guilty verdicts for Hirobayashi, Korematsu, and Yasue. The government had lied and suppressed evidence, destroyed evidence to prove their cases. Next. The commission, after all its testimony and research and analysis, came to the conclusion that there was no military necessity. There was no need for mass incarceration of the Japanese Americans. And this is a statement they make in writing, documented in this statement, which is in a book that they published on this subject. The statement is, the cause of incarceration and the Executive Order 9066 was race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. Next slide, please. Because of some of these facts that were uncovered during these research investigations in the 1980s, in a legal procedure called writ of error coram nobis, these three cases for Korematsu, Hirobayashi, and Yasui were brought back to the courts. And this was allowed because these three men were found guilty. They served their penalties, their time in jail, and evidence was found that there was reason to bring these cases back. Now, as a result of these cases coming back to the local courts, not to the Supreme Court, all three were vacated. Their judgments were vacated, and they were found to be not guilty. And the government did not appeal these cases, and therefore they did not go back to the Supreme Court. Next slide. So later on, you could see that Fred Korematsu received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton. Min Yasui in Portland, Oregon, received a Medal of Freedom posthumously, as did Gordon Hirabayashi in Seattle in 2012. So the honor was restored to these three men. Next slide, please. Next slide.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States.
The first words that President Reagan used in his speech were right a grave wrong. And the theme of our talk today and the theme of the program is righting a wrong. And so that's what we're trying to discuss with you. This was the culmination of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that President Reagan was speaking about. What it accomplished was, because of all the testimony, the public was educated, the government was educated back in the 1980s, and realized what they had committed was a grave wrong. And so they acknowledged the fact that there was a mistake made in 1942 which was 80 years ago today, that President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And again, the words of the commission were, the cause of this act was race prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. The outcome of this was that we received, and this included, we includes about 80,000 Japanese who were still alive in the mid 1980s to receive this. We received an apology from the president in a formal letter, and I have a copy of that letter that I received myself, and we each received a check for $20,000, which I received and made a copy of, and I will say cashed. So what we're talking about today is a day of remembrance, and a day of remembrance is something to think about, of something that happened in the past, to remember something of the past. And throughout the country, in the US, there are many days of remembrance being enacted, and it happened last week, it's going on today, and it's going to continue for the next week or so in some of the major cities, primarily I would say in California, throughout the towns and cities of California and Washington, excuse me, and some of the cities in Oregon and on the East Coast, there are days of remembrance that are going on. And the primary purpose is to just remember what had happened in the past. But I think that one of the values of remembering the past and acknowledging history and understanding history is to think of how we could affect it for what we do today and in the future. You know, we say sometimes that history does not repeat itself. I'm of the belief that history does repeat itself. We do have to keep on our toes. There were things that were going on in the prior administration, I will say, and in prior administrations to that, where people did not seem to remember what had happened to the Japanese Americans. One example is some representatives of President Trump tried to do away with birthright citizenship rights. Now, this is something in the 14th Amendment. It's a guarantee of our Constitution. My father and mother were born in America. They're second generation Japanese Americans. They proved their loyalty to America through the war years and beyond until they passed away. There was a threat that their birthright, this concept of birthright citizenship was going to be removed for future generations, and that would have been a very wrong act. Another thing that we have to remember is the anti-Asian, anti-Japanese sentiment and acts that took place during World War II against the Japanese American population because of what the Empire of Japan had done. The Japanese in America were Americans. They were loyal Americans. However, because of the color of their skin, the looks of their faces, they were pointed out as being a threat, not to be trusted. Today, we have that same sentiment, I will say. There's an anti-Asian sentiment that's going around, not to the same degree, perhaps, but there's violence that's focused on the Japanese and the other Asian communities. I know that there have been some scattered cases of Asians being pushed to the ground and in some cases dying, being pushed in front of a subway car and dying. This sort of thing lingers on. I will say that this kind of attitude is something that does not disappear easily, if at all, and is something that we just must be aware of as we look at history and some of the consequences of history can bring. Thank you very much. Deborah?
Yes. All right. Thank you so much for from both of you for speaking. So now if we want to, if Jim, you want to unmute, we can have a brief Q&A session. And because there are so many people, I was thinking that if people want to drop a question in the chat box, then I can read it out loud so that we don't have competing audio. Yes, this will be posted on YouTube. That is why we're recording it, because we know that, you know, some people won't be able to make it today.
Overwhelmed.
I see no questions.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in.
Can I throw one thing? Can I add one thing?
Mm-hmm.
The this sentiment that I was talking about, that's carrying forward. It's also is in the state of Rhode Island. There's a holiday called Victory Day, or it's also known as Victory over Japan Day, and it's a celebration of World War II and victory over Japan. The holiday takes place in August or in August of each year. Now, it's originally set up as a holiday to celebrate victory over a country. However, I say that the sentiment, this celebration also carries over to the feelings of Japanese Americans. And I, for one, being Japanese American, feel that this holiday, this celebration is targeted to me as well. And I would like to see this holiday ended.
So we do have some questions in the chat now. Can either of you speak more about what Japanese Americans in Hawaii experienced, or where we could learn more about that?
Jim, why don't you take that one?
Okay, I'll give it a shot. The Japanese in Hawaii had a very different experience, and there are a lot of angles to it. There were some Japanese in Hawaii who were incarcerated, and some were actually even sent to the mainland, but it didn't happen on a very large scale. There were internment camps in Hawaii, a very big one on Oahu called Honouliuli that have been studied. One of the problems that they faced, the Japanese in Hawaii faced after Pearl Harbor, was that they were living in a racially mixed, ethnically mixed community. There were a lot of people there who were, for instance, from the Philippines. Well, the Filipinos were not very happy with the way that they were being treated by the Japanese government. So there were initially concerns that there might be violence, inter-ethnic violence in Hawaii. This was handled from the top very gingerly by General Emmons, who was the military commander there. He appointed what was called a morale committee, which was an inter-ethnic committee that was designed to consult with the various groups and keep the problem of violence from occurring. That was one of the things that happened. Hawaii also had many Japanese Americans in the two National Guard units. They didn't stay National Guard units, but they became the nucleus of what was later on the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was one of the groups of Japanese American segregated soldiers that fought in Europe. It's a very famous unit. They're very proud of it out there in Hawaii. There are several books written about this. I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding references. You can go to Densho website Densho and look at their encyclopedia and get references to a lot of these books.
The resistance or the anti-Japanese sentiment in California and Washington and Oregon as well, to some degree, were based on economic factors. The Japanese were very successful as agriculturalists. They had their truck farms in Southern California. They were growers of certain types of vegetables and were the primary growers of certain vegetables and flowers, and were very successful in areas that the white farmers had given up. However, because of the Japanese method of farming, they were able to be very productive in their growing. So when World War II was declared and there was anti-Japanese sentiment being spread throughout the areas of the West Coast, many of those who were the loudest were the farmers' unions, the growers' unions, the business leaders, because they felt that the Japanese were competition. and this was a very important force of pressure that was put on the Japanese. In Hawaii, the situation was that those who worked, and I would say, I'm not positive of this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jim. Those who worked on the pineapple plantations and the other farms, the sugar plantations were Japanese, and these people were needed for the growing and the harvesting of the crops, and therefore, because of the economic necessity to keep these Japanese Hawaiians employed, there was less of a clamor for incarceration.
Yeah, let me add something to that too. General Emmons realized as he was facing pressure from Washington to pack off all the Japanese in Hawaii to Molokai, which is the site of the famous leper colony, as you know. General Emmons realized that the economy would basically shut down if they removed all the Japanese people of Japanese ancestry from the economy. So he used that argument to resist the pressure from Washington. He also said, well, we'll have to think about it, but we're going to need so many ships to move all these people. And Washington said, well, we don't have those ships. So that sort of made it easy for him as well. But he basically resisted the pressure from Washington to institute a large-scale mass evacuation and internment of Japanese in Hawaii. One interesting side note to that too is General Emmons, when the war ended, left Hawaii and became the commander of the Western Defense Command, which is what DeWitt had been commanding. I think I've got that right.
We have a few more questions. Can kind of combine two. How is the Japanese American Citizens League ensuring that this history is taught? And then relevant to that, how is this subject matter taught in schools around the country?
Well, Margie Yamamoto is the person who should answer that question. I don't know if she's still on, but the Japanese American Citizens League is very active, and particularly in many of these days of remembrance are sponsored by the JACL. So that is one of their main missions. It's the civil rights organization, but also educational, has educational objectives as well.
If I could expand that question to include how is let me get to that question. Where is it at the beginning?
No, it's two questions that are kind of near the end. I combined them because they were related.
In addition to the JACL, I belong to the Tule Lake Committee. I'm on the board of the Tule Lake Committee, and we're making efforts to reach out to the public, to educate the public. We have at Tule Lake, we have a docent program that we're developing, and part of the docent program is to not only educate those who come to the pilgrimages, but to be docents in the communities, at the local schools, and to spread the word of, as Jim and I just did in our presentation today, spread the word of Executive Order 9066 and what happened to the Japanese Americans. And so it's an effort that goes beyond JACL, I would say. There are presentations all over the country today on this subject, and I think that's part of the way that this educational process is being carried forward.
We have another question. Due to the efforts of the Quakers during World War II, about 3,500 college-age students were able to leave internment camps and go to U.S. colleges. Do we know if any of these students attended Brown University?
Not to my knowledge. They did not attend Brown University. I've actually looked into that because I'm associated with an organization that's related to that problem, that history. No, Brown, as far as I know, did not have any Japanese American students who were released under the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council, which was the formal council, and they were Quaker dominated, no question about that. The Quakers were big players in that. Brown had one very famous Japanese American student, John Iso, who was the highest ranking Japanese American officer in World War II. He was the head, the main instructor of the Military Intelligence Service Language School, and he graduated from Brown.
I have two aunts who were at Tule Lake, and as 17 and 18-year-old young ladies, they had the benefit of the Quaker program, and both of them went to schools, and not to Brown, but they went to schools in Pennsylvania. One of them graduated in chemistry, and the other decided to leave before she graduated.
We have some other comments, sort of talking about the earlier agricultural discussion. Coda Farms is a good example, property taken, but now back in the family and producing the most excellent rice.
So what's the question?
Oh, it was a comment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we don't have any more questions. We do have some comments that I can either read or people can look through. Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you so much, Jim. Oh, we have another. Yeah. This is asking about Rhode Island being the only state that has VJ Day, and Ken asking for your views.
My view is that it seems that Rhode Island is a little bit narrow-minded in this. I know that there is a large veterans population here, and many still survivors of World War II are still residents of Rhode Island. And I know that the families would like to keep this holiday going. And I know that the industry of Rhode Island, the munitions industries, the military transportation industries were very instrumental in World War II. And these may be the areas where there is resistance to change victory over Japan Day. However, as a Japanese American, living in 2022, I think that we may be reaching a time when we should be thinking a little bit differently about this.
So to that end, what efforts are being made? This is another question, to eliminate VJ Day in Rhode Island.
My campaign has just begun, and I'm speaking to a few legislators on this. And so I think one of the lessons I learned is from in my presentation, I said earlier, there was a commission on the wartime relocation and internment of civilians. One of the processes that took place then was to educate the public and the government as to what took place with the Japanese, and use that education as a way to shift sentiment. I think one of the issues with something like this with the Japanese is that there are still many people in Rhode Island who don't have an understanding or knowledge of World War II history. Jim and I have spoken to many groups over the last 3 or 4 years, and spoken about Japanese American history. And we found that in many cases, the people were not aware of this history. And so education is a very important part of the process to get it going. And so I don't see it as being something that could be turned around overnight. It's something that requires work and convincing and persuasion and a reason for it to happen. And so that's how I'm approaching it at the moment.
We have a comment from Margie Yamamoto of the New England JACL. The JACL is sponsoring workshops this summer for teachers to come to California and learn about and teach teachers about the Japanese American experience. So you can go to the website nejacl.org and learn about this project. I think that's all the questions. Thank you both again. Thank you to the New England Japanese American Citizens League. Thank you to everyone who worked with me on this show and with the museum. I guess I'll stop recording now.